What is up, Janksters? It's your boy Graham, also known as HamHawks42 on the internet, and today I want to discuss the lands for the upcoming Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth set. Now, this set's going to be releasing in June, and as of this recording, we have seen a couple of legendary lands that will be included with it, and I think they're kind of interesting, so I wanted to take a minute, break it down, take a look at them, and the two that we're going to be talking about is Mount Doom and the Shire. And given the events of the story and kind of where they take place, I figured it would be appropriate rather to start where the story of the Lord of the Rings starts, in the Shire. So the Shire is a legendary land, enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a legendary creature. It taps to add 1 green, or you can pay 1 green, tap an untapped creature you control, create a food token. So I think this land is interesting because it's the drawback on it is very minimal. That's one of the things. Whenever you have a land that does something, any kind of utility land, which there are tons in Magic, we've seen them all the time, they have to have a downside, because lands don't inherently have any downside whatsoever, because lands are free to cast. You know, they're free to play. They don't even use the freaking stack. Your opponent can't interact with them at all. I mean, when you play a land, you just play it. It's the only card type in Magic that is like that. Unlike in Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh, where you can just cast, or you can just play your stuff just cause, which I know are very different games. So the fact that this is the fact that lands just enter the battlefield and do whatever they need to do, they don't inherently have a downside. Whereas casting cost on spells inherently give it some kind of balancing element. So Wizards knows this and generally balances their lands pretty appropriately. In the early game, in the early days of Magic, what they would do is they would give you lands that didn't tap for mana. Like that was one of the big drawbacks. Like, so Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale is like a key example, or Maze of Ith is a great example that is not as maybe not as expensive as Tabernacle, to be fair, but both of those cards are examples of lands that don't tap for mana but give you some other utility. So they're a nice little bonus, but the downside, theoretically, is that if you play them, you do not play your land, so you're not advancing up your mana curve, which is notable. That is a downside. So something to keep in mind. Generally speaking, the upsides on those cards is worth it in most cases, but not always. So what Wizards will do is they'll add downsides to cards. And in the case of the Shire, we have a couple. So for one, it's legendary, meaning if you're in a format where you're allowed to have up to 4 of any given card, you really don't want to be running 4 of the Shire. Because if you look at the top 7 cards in your hand, if you look at your first 7 and you're debating on a mull and you see 3 copies of the Shire and they're your only lands, that is not a 3-land hand. It's really not. That is in fact a 1-land hand. And you have 2 dead cards. So that's really bad. So as a result, when you're building your decks, don't put multiple legendary lands in, which is why a lot of the time in standard or even older formats where you see people running the channel lands from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, they'll run 1, maybe 2. You very rarely see 3 or 4 of those lands in a deck, unless it's like a one specific, where the channel effect is especially potent in that particular brew. But for the most part, those are like 1 or 2 of us, because they're basically like, there's no reason not to run 1 or 2 of them, because then you get a land and sometimes you get a spell. Cool. But with the Shire, all you're doing is creating a food token. That's all it is. And it's going to cost you 2 mana. You also have to tap a mana-producing land, so that's effectively 3 mana, and you have to tap an untapped creature control to make that food token. So that is a tall order. You do a lot, and then in the end, all you get is a food token. Now, that said, we have seen at least one other card in the Lord of the Rings set. I believe it's the Uncommon Sam, or no, it might be the Mythic Sam. Anyway, there's one of the Samwises that makes food less expensive to activate. So presumably there are other food synergies, and that being tied to the hobbits and the Shire makes a lot of sense, because the Shire is this fertile ground that the hobbits are, tending and farming. And one of the things we learn about the hobbits very early on in the series is all about how much, actually, you learn in the Hobbit prior to Lord of the Rings even happening, you learn about how much they love just a good meal. And they talk about all the time how many meals hobbits eat. So hobbits being tied to food tokens, yeah, of course. Like, it's kind of a given, right? It makes perfect sense. So this is like flavorfully dead on. It works. Is the card good? I don't necessarily think so, unless you have a lot of other food synergies. Like, being able to leverage the Shire alongside cards like Gilded Goose is not bad. or cards like Wicked Wolf, I guess, that like had other uses for food. It's not bad, but I don't know. You gotta have a lot of food synergies before I'm willing to run this over even just Untapped Forest. Now that said, I'm sure it's going to exist. We'll see if it pans out. Now the next one I want to talk about is Mount Doom. So this is a legendary land. It has tap, pay 1 life, add black or red. Note it enters untapped. You can also pay 1 black red tap. Mount Doom deals 1 damage to each opponent. You can also pay 5 black red tap, sacrifice Mount Doom and a legendary artifact. Choose up to 2 creatures, then destroy the rest. Activate only as a sorcery. Okay, so the Shire felt very limited in what decks I want to run it in. Mount Doom feels like a slam dunk home run in a lot of different style decks. If I'm in any kind of aggressive strategy in Rakdos, now I want to be in both black and red because I want to be able to take advantage of those other abilities, because otherwise it's just an angry duel. I don't necessarily like that. The idea of paying 1 life every single time I want to tap one of my lands, it hurts. So the pain lands from Dominaria, we recently got those back into standard through Dominaria Remastered, Shivan Reef and Yavimaya Coast and the like. Those are cool because they tap for colorless, or they can deal 1 damage to you and tap for for the color of your choice. So they're decent in that regard. Because they can fix your colors, but it hurts you to do so. But if you just want to, if your colors are taken care of with other lands, then they're just lands. They just do the thing and they don't hurt you. With Mount Doom, there is no colorless option. Every time you tap this for every time you tap this for mana, you're gonna lose a life. Every single time, it's just how it works. If you're using the other abilities though, you don't. So okay, not bad. And the ability to pay 3, tap it, and deal 1 damage to each opponent. In like 60 card aggressive decks, I can see that being decent. I don't know that a Rakdos aggro deck exists in any format where Mount Doom is going to be legal that makes that worth considering. I genuinely don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, we see cards like Ramanap Ruins, where it's something like pay 4 and sacrifice it and deals 2 damage to your opponent. That gives the red decks reach into the late game, because if your opponent wraths the board, you still have this last little punch that you can use to get in to finish it. Mount Doom does that too. Except you can do it turn after turn, theoretically. So that's pretty sweet. Also, if you have anything that triggers when your opponents lose life, this just activates to do that. Now, it costs you 3 mana and tapping a mana-producing land in order to activate it, just for 1 damage. So, I mean, your mileage may vary. There are some decks that can really take advantage of that, and others where maybe not. But having that available without having to attack is pretty cool. Like, I like that. I think that might be worth it in certain decks. It's maybe not all of them, but a lot of them. Now, the last mode, this is where I think most decks, if you can use it, if you can get there, it's going to be great. 7, tap, sack it, and a legendary artifact. So you have to have legendary artifacts in your deck, but there are a fair number of those in the game. But then choose up to 2 creatures, then destroy the rest. So you blow up, you get to keep your 2 best creatures. Or if you don't have any creatures, you don't need to worry about it. And then you just clean the board. So putting a board wipe on a land is pretty intense. And it doesn't have to be symmetrical. Your board, you keep up to 2 creatures. Now, the reason for this, that is clearly representing the moment when Gollum fell into the fires of Mount Doom with the ring. That's clearly what's happening, because shortly after that, all of Mordor erupted, and everything just completely got wrecked, and the eagle swooped in and saved Frodo and Sam, who were in the midst of it all. So there we go. So we have the 2 creatures and the rest getting wiped out. So that does kind of make sense. Flavorfully, it hits the nail on the head, hits the mark, checks the boxes, whatever metaphor you'd like to use. So in that regard, I think Mount Doom is pretty cool. And I think in most of my commander decks that are running legendary artifacts of any kind, I probably would want this if it matches the colors. Now, the more I think about it, though, the more I realize how narrow that is. So your deck is going to want to be able to use one or the other mode. And I think in Commander, I'm mostly worried about that 7 mana mode. Because being able to ping your opponents if you have excess mana lying up is fine. But what are the chances of that actually working? I think it's pretty minimal. I think it's more beneficial if you can take advantage of that board wipe. I think having access to a board wipe on hand is really useful. So how many legendary artifacts does your deck run is really what it comes down to. Because if you don't have an artifact if you don't have a legendary artifact on the field, you can't take advantage of that last mode. So that's really what it comes down to. I guess that's really what determines if this deck is good. Can you get your opponent to almost dead so you can kill him with the 3-mana ability, or are you going to run into the long game or will you likely have a legendary artifact on the field? I mean, obviously it combines with the One Ring itself, which is like the epic flavor win, but still. I mean, the perfect situation, and I have no doubt these commander decks will happen, themed commander decks, where your goal is actually to save Sam and Frodo and use the One Ring as the sacrificial blast, which, I don't know, it's fine. You can do that. Also, as the last note, so I think Mount Doom is a solid card. I like both these cards, actually. I think they're decent without being broken, which when you're putting spell-like effects or enchantment-like effects on lands, you run the risk of it being overpowered just because they operate outside of the mana system, kind of. You know, they're the resource, not the effect generally. So, but I think Wizards has done a good job of dialing that in so that they're good without being broken. I think these are both really solid but narrow, which is exactly where you want your utility lands to be. So the last thing I want to mention, there are a number of basics that will be included in this set that are actually that have the artwork of the original maps that were printed in the books, which, if I'm not mistaken, was art that Tolkien himself drew. Check me if I'm wrong on that, because I might be. I need to, or no, I'm sorry, they're not. Looks like the artist is Devin Rue, but they're modeled after, which, okay, now I need to look that up. Otherwise, lest I put my foot in my mouth even more than I usually do, which is already saying something. But in any event, they clearly model the maps that were printed in the original book. Like when you opened the Fellowship of the Ring, there would be a map on the inside cover, and this is what it is. And I think that's really cool. And they're leveraging portions of those maps and, you know, as full art lands. I think that's fantastic and a beautiful way to, celebrate this, this franchise that so many of us love. I get a big kick out of that. And I think these are great, and they're probably going to be worth something. Although my hope is that they print these into the ground, and there are just a ton of these lying around all over the place. That way, if you want them, you can go get them. Which is the case with a lot of the full arts these days, a lot of the full art basics, and I think that should stay that way. I really like the idea of there being a million different full art basics, and you can just pick whichever style you want for whatever deck you have, and you won't have trouble getting them. I think that's really cool, and I want Wizards to keep doing that. Because, I don't know, it gives the basics value in a way that the standard basics that get printed with standard sets often lack. Even though the artwork and everything on them is great. It's just, I don't know. We often just see them as trivial or dime a dozen, and these look like something special. So, anyway, thanks so much for checking out the show. I appreciate it. Yeah, this is available as a podcast, by the way. If you're watching this on the YouTube channel, it's available as a podcast, Overthinking MTG. And if you're listening on the podcast, thank you so much. It's also available on YouTube, fun fact. Anyway, thank you so much, and I'll catch you on the next one.